these screaming griffins here flanking the sparking fire steels of the Order of the Golden Fleece at the front. But as spectacular as this armor was for both man and horse, there was a horse armor that sort of served as a complement to this work that was written by Maximilian's master of horse. And I apologize if you can hear some cars outside. I'm in Detroit, which is very much the motor city. It's also quite sunny out, so it's invited everyone to come out in their various motorized conveyances, which I think is quite apropos of our barded horse. So although the bard that clad Maximilian's horse when he entered Luxembourg was impressive, other pieces of equine armor that Lawrence Helmschmidt had forged for the prince surpassed it in technical innovation and visual impact. And so on September 13th, just a couple weeks prior to Maximilian's entry into Luxembourg, his master of horse, Albert May, had entered the city of Namur. And in that entry, May rode a horse whose body was sheathed in flexible plate armor from head to hooves. Through the armorer's art, the steed was transformed into a fantastically scaled beast. And we can imagine how impressive it would have been to see a horse prancing through the streets, not only encased, really encrusted in the insignia of the houses of Habsburg and Burgundy, but also completely encapsulated in articulated steel plates. And the patral or plate that covered the horse's chest, again, was embossed and etched with two griffins lifted from the iconography of the Order of the Stole and Jar, a knightly order that had been revived by Maximilian's father, Emperor Friedrich III. And the heraldic beasts here flank the insignia of the Golden Fleece, which again is the cross of St. Andrew and the sparking fire steels. On the crupper or flank defense, we see the etched figure of a young woman clad in the high-waisted gown and pointed Hennin headdress, that traditional princess hat, that were popular at the Burgundian court during the period. And she holds a shield with the combined arms of Habsburg and Burgundy. And it seems like she's a representation of Mary of Burgundy herself, who had wed Maximilian just before this moment, and on whose behalf Maximilian was then fighting in a war to maintain ducal power in the Netherlands, and as I mentioned, dispel French incursions. Now, the armor that Maximilian wore in his entry into Luxembourg survives. And I just want to say that, all of these objects really show us how cognizant of the importance of armor as a physical defense and a means of visual communication Maximilian was. And he specifically summoned his court armorer, Lawrence Helmschmidt, to the Low Countries from Augsburg in February of 1480. And Burgundian court records of that time mention Lawrence of Augsburg, armorer to my aforementioned lord, at least 3 times. And Lawrence was paid upon his arrival for, quote, bards of steel, cuirasses, and clothes of test, meaning armors tested against projectiles, along with armors for the legs and other pieces. And this elegant field armor, which really is archetypal in its late Gothic style, is likely the very armor that Maximilian rode into Luxembourg and that is later represented in combination with the articulated steel horse bard in the Thun Hohenstein album's drawing. And Lawrence remained in the Low Countries until 1481 and was actually present at the Burgundian court when the entries into Luxembourg and Namur took place. And indeed, prior to his return to Augsburg, he was paid an additional 1,575 livres, which is roughly the equivalent of a townhouse in the city of Bruges at this time. This is like the equivalent of a townhouse in New York in 1480. He was paid this additional amount for, quote, clothes of war, including especially some bards forged of steel for armor of test. So the horse is well protected also. He's wearing steel that's been tested against crossbow bolts and other projectiles, and including a collar, chafron, or defense for the horse's face, plates for the belly and legs, and various other parts, serving to arm a horse all over, and done by him with 800 florins of gold trim. And I want to underscore how much this object and others that Lawrence Helmschmidt delivered to Maximilian at this time really facilitated his own elevation as court armorer. And we can see here in his signature marks, both the Stadtpier of the city of Augsburg and the Steckhelm or jousting helmet that he would later adopt as part of his own heraldic insignia in concert with a rooster wielding a mace and wearing a helmet. So we get the elevation of the armorer himself to a status that allowed him the privilege of bearing arms at this point for his service of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this armor survives at least in part. So we can see where aspects of this full body horse bard may have survived in the elements of armor that we know were actually delivered to Friedrich III in 1477. And this idea of interchangeability comes into play. So when we look at the images and we look at particularly this dragon tail plate, the beautiful heraldic eagle with the Binden shield here representing the Habsburg arms, we can think about how these elements may possibly not only evoke the splendor of the objects that existed during the period, but may also have been intentionally interchangeable with them. And a letter written by the Venetian diplomat Andrea Franceschi describes, quote, a horse armored head to foot, an extremely glittering sight. And he talks about how on its flanks were the eagle cruppers that we see here, this representation of a double-headed eagle with the Binden shield. So again, we get these multiple deployments over the course of Maximilian's sort of life, both as Duke of Burgundy and later as German King of the Romans before he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor, redeploying these beautiful sort of signposts for his status through his imagery here. And we can think also about the ways that these sorts of processions, particularly the act of sending Albrecht May into Namur before him, evoke the ways that tournament participants are meant to come into the city, and the ways that their sorts of heraldic devices, their arms and armors are meant to serve as metonyms for their identities as they enter the city. So writing around 1460, King René d'Anjou described how a prince's steed should precede his entry into the city in his treatise on the form and organization of the tournament, known as the Livre de Tournoi. And we saw that in the Kolben Tourneur as well. And René states the destrier, or war horse of the prince, ought to enter the city first covered with the device of the captain and with 4 escutcheons of the captain's arms on the 4 limbs of the horse. And the horse's head decorated with ostrich feathers, and on the horse's neck a collar of bells, and in the saddle a very small page. And the Livre de Tournoi was quite familiar to the Burgundian court, including Maximilian, and also demonstrates the metonymic nature not only of the horse that is caparisoned in all of these heraldic insignia, but also of the armor itself. And in addition to René's description of the entry of the captain's horse, the author relates how the crested helms of the tournament participants should be processed into the city and brought by their squires to a cloister or banqueting hall. And there, the helms or crests served as really evocations of their wearers that could be symbolically judged and even cast down in punishment if a knight's conduct was deemed unchivalrous. So the Livre de Tournoi's emphasis on the associative impact of recognizable armors, emblazoned with heraldic signs of their owners' identities, suggests ways that the understanding of how the armored horse's procession through Namur visually declared Maximilian's assumption of the leadership as the new Duke of Burgundy and his reclamation of Burgundian lands from French incursions. Now, thinking a little bit about this representation of the armored horse, I want to underscore not only how it evokes this concept of sending the sort of the master of horse in on this billboard, this heraldic insignia of power, but also the ways that the paintings themselves that we've just looked at evoke the heraldic culture of the period. So they, alongside the panels commissioned for the meetings of the Order of the Golden Fleece, are attributed to Pierre Coustin, who was a court painter at the court of Burgundy. And in this representation, we can really see the ways that this beautiful sort of image of the arms of Edward IV as a knight of the Golden Fleece combines the Kolben helm, which we discussed just a moment ago, and this collar of the Order of the Golden Fleece to present the stuffs of identity, both objects and heraldic signs, as sort of parts of this knightly whole that evoke the personae of the Knights of the Golden Fleece. And I'm going to skip a little bit forward in my discussion of the Thun Hohenstein album. You mentioned that you can find more information about this in my book. But in order to sort of stick to time, I also want to move into a discussion of armors later on, and particularly a discussion of a few different works here in Detroit in my own collection, which is really an understudied area within arms and armor history, because I'm the first expert in European arms and armor to join the curatorial staff. And the two armors that I want to share with you, sort of as we wrap up this talk portion of today's event, are both armors associated with Anton Pfaffenhauser. And I mentioned Lorenz Helmschmidt and the way that he really established and elevated himself as not only a sort of a grubby-handed smith, but also really a player within the courtly world of the Habsburg Burgundian Netherlands and later the Holy Roman Empire more broadly. He was able to elevate himself to a level of status that allowed him the privilege of having a coat of arms, which was then passed on to his son Colman and his grandson Desiderius. And Desiderius was likely the teacher or the master under whom Anton Pfaffenhauser trained. And Pfaffenhauser was one of the last in the great lineage of Augsburg armorers that was really founded by Lawrence in the late 15th century. And Pfaffenhauser's career extended from about 1525 until 1603. It's a very long career. And we see his funerary epitaph here, or at least a rubbing of it, as the church in which the armorers of Augsburg were buried was actually destroyed in the Second World War. And so we see this rubbing, and we're able to see Anton here alongside 3 of his 14 children. And alongside him, we see his heraldic device, his coat of arms, which represents a triskelion, these 3 armored legs forming a circle. And that triskelion actually appears in many of his works as his maker's mark. And this is very common among armorers who we know were granted heraldic arms. It seems that the maker's mark likely came first, and they adapted that as part of their own self-representation and identity. And this is quite beautiful because this is actually a backplate for an armor that resides in Detroit that was made by Pfaffenhauser probably in the 1560s. And it has the triskelion alongside this beautiful impression of the Augsburg Stadtpier, which is both the insignia of the city, this representation of a fir cone atop a pedestal, sort of like a pine cone, as it were. And that is both the arms of the city and the insignia of the Armorers Guild, who would stamp this into the metal after having inspected it. So this is our not only our signature from the maker, but our inspection mark indicating that this is worthy of both the maker's name and the name of the city. So one of the armors that I want to share with you that resides here in Detroit is an armor that we can associate with Anton Pfaffenhauser's circle, if not the maker's own hand. And this is a half armor for the field made for a member of the Khevenhuller family. It's an armor that was created in a style called the Hungarian style. So you can see that unlike that barred and late Gothic armor we see made for Maximilian and his steed, it actually doesn't encase much of the body at all. We would have mail sleeves worn here between the shoulders and lower arms. And you can also see that on the belly of the armor, it has, instead of a solid plate, these articulated limbs that allow the wearer to sort of move with nimbleness as he rides and wields perhaps a saber or a pair of pistols. This is indicative of the sort of evolution of battlefield attire over the course of the 16th century, which is achieving a balance between protection and mobility. There's always that tension, right? You can lose vision, you can lose mobility as you increase protection, which is why tournament armor frequently includes very, very protective objects, because You don't necessarily need to see all around you. No one's attacking you from the back in a joust. But in a battlefield context where one would wear an armor like this, the necessity of having nimble armor, particularly on the eastern eaves of the Holy Roman Empire, where there were most often clashes and tensions between imperial troops and representatives of the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Sepahis, who were famous for their nimble cavalry tactics. This ability to have very light, very nimble armor was extremely important. And like the armor I showed at the beginning of the talk that was blued, this armor retains much of its fire bluing from the period. So we can see these beautiful passages of deep blue that continue to reside on the armor. And this is a work that was associated with the Khepenhula family more broadly. And through additional research, we were able to narrow it down to two members of the Khepenhula family, either Hans von Khepenhula, who was a diplomat and ambassador to the court of Spain, or his brother Bartolomeus. And upon deeper examination, there were actually sword cuts along the top of this helmet, which suggests that they did not belong to Hans, the diplomat, but that instead the armor was likely owned by Bartolomeus Khepenhula, who was an imperial chamberlain and master of horse, as well as a war counselor and governor for the Austrian province of Carinthia. And so this is a person who actually participated in combat extensively over the course of the late 16th century and would have worn the armor in both martial and sort of diplomatic or pageantry events, because this is such a beautifully crafted and decorative object. It's likely that the armor was retained at Bartolomeus Khepenhula's own castle of Landskron, which he and his descendants resided in until 1628. And I want to emphasize the extent to which there's a little bit of a pun happening, as well as a heraldic echo in this armor. So when we look at the back of the work, it has these beautiful pauldrons, these shoulder defenses that are etched with floriated forms, these trilobate leaves that adorn the sort of scapulae, the shoulder blades of the wearer. And these are absolutely beautiful in their etched and gilt decoration of the armor, but they also allude potentially to the Khepenhula family's ancestral home and heraldry. So the Khepenhula family originally came from Schloss Eichelberg, and actually the full name of the family is Khepenhula zu Eichelberg, or of Oak Mountain. And that association with a historical castle, which is now a ruin, actually lent them their heraldic device, which is an acorn and two leaves, this beautiful trilobate, very foliate form. So this idea of the acorn, the Oak Mountain, is something that we see potentially echoed in both the Khepenhula armor that lives here in Detroit, and we can see it here in the Familienbuch Khepenhula, which is preserved at Hoch Ostowitz, which is still one of the main castle abodes of this Austrian noble family. But we can also see it represented in the burgonets, or the liveries issued to the guards of the Khepenhula family. So this is actually a burgonet that is preserved in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And again, we see this beautiful acorn and oak leaves in sort of a trilobate form here adorning the side of this helmet. So the Khepenhula armor that lives in the DIA, this beautiful half armor in the Hungarian style, was resident in Berg Landskron until the 1620s. And at that moment, the Khepenhula family, who were descended from Bartolomeus, were actually expelled from Austria because Bartolomeus had converted to Protestantism. And during the tumults of the 30 Years' War, his sons actually were required to leave, and they migrated to Germany, where their granddaughters married into the family of the Counts of Gieck. And so here we see the castle of Schloss Turnau, which is the ancestral castle of the Counts of Gieck. And this is where that armor resided from the 17th century until 1923, when it was purchased by William Randolph Hearst, the great newspaper magnate and voracious collector of art in all media, from whom the Detroit Institute of Arts acquired it as an estate gift following his death in 1951. And indeed, the inventory of the armory here at Schloss Turnau mentions a fine steel harness or armor, essentially. When I say harness, I mean what we would now sort of retrospectively call a suit of armor, which is not quite accurate. But it mentions a fine steel armor that is, quote, chiseled or etched with gold arabesques, which was a gift from Kaiser Matthias or Emperor Matthias to Count von Khepenhüller. So it gives us yet another little tantalizing clue to the history of this armor that has sort of an interesting heraldic abstraction adorning it, but also a really phenomenally interesting history and wearer. And finally, I want to finish up by talking about an armor that really beautifully evokes this idea of the afterlives of the object. This is an armor that we know was commissioned from Anton Pfaffenhauser and created by the master in his workshop. Its construction and appearance are identical to a series of tournament armors from the Munich arsenal. And these were commissioned by Wilhelm V von Wittelsbach, who was the Duke of Bavaria. And he ordered these from Pfaffenhauser in 1579 or 1580, the very year he succeeded his father. And these armors, as I mentioned, exist in a series. So examples from the series of 12 now also reside in other significant collections of arms and armor, including the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the Wallace Collection in London. And the DIA armor and its siblings were designed for the joust over the barrier in the Italian style, or the Welschgesteck. In English, the name of this tournament event derives from the term for the barrier that separated the two charging riders, which is the tilt. So these are tilting armors. And this armor weighs just over 80 pounds, which is much, much more than the lighter, more nimble armors worn on the battlefield. So for instance, that Khepenhüller armor we just looked at weighs only about 35 pounds in total. And the full Gothic armor that we looked at that Lawrence Helmschmidt delivered to Maximilian I in 1480 weighs between 45 and 50 pounds. So these things are quite a bit lighter than we would initially think. But when we're looking at tournament armors, again, as I mentioned, nobody's attacking you from behind. You're among friends. You're participating in knightly sport. So you can sacrifice mobility and visibility for protection, because you want to make sure you don't get hurt in the tournament and that your friends don't get hurt. And these tilting armors, again, are heavily, heavily reinforced, and they have these immensely heavy helmets that weigh around 16 pounds, that are secured to their back and breastplate with stout screws to protect the wearer's neck. And actually, in this somewhat industrial detail, draws our attention not only to the graceful shape of the backplate, but also to the inspection mark of the Augsburg Armorers Guild. Again, this fir cone or pine cone insignia called the Schabbier. And here we can see that it's a slightly different punch than the one we saw on the other armor by Pfaffenhauser, made about 20 years earlier. Now, the armor's left shoulder and chest that we see here are covered in a cape-like grand guard, which was designed to withstand and deflect the blows of a charging opponent's lance. And the surfaces of both the helmet and the grand guard are streamlined. Their sort of surprisingly modern silhouettes are part of that deflection technology. And this series of armors really functioned as both protective surface and high fashion for the Bavarian courtiers who wore them. The breastplate's pointed or peas-cod style belly and the ample curvature of the skirt-like hip defenses or fauds evoke the bombastic forms of late 16th century men's fashion. And for instance, we can see this fashion echoed in a portrait of Archduke Charles II of Austria, which envisions the prince clad in a peascod type doublet with wide trunk hose. And Pfaffenhauser's workshop here really beautifully translates the artistic styles of the day, the aristocratic fashions, from fabric into steel. And like other forms of jousts, as well as chivalric contests between mounted teams or mock combats on foot, the tilt was an important part of courtly celebrations and state events. And so these armors were actually made in connection with an exciting series of tournaments. And here we can see associations with potentially the tournament held in Munich to celebrate William's marriage to Duchess Renee of Lorraine. And in an echo of our fashion plate just a couple slides ago, prints from the tournament book published to commemorate these festivities depict a joust across the barrier between Wilhelm and Archduke Charles of Austria, whose fashionable portrait we just saw. And each prince wears a tilting armor, not unlike the example that now resides in Detroit. And we can see the vibrant plumes that crown the figures, as well as the heraldic comparison that covers the steed of Charles of Austria, showing the Bindenschild of his family, the House of Habsburg, as well as, again, that Raguli cross of St. Andrew, which is the insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Now, one of the things about this armor is that it shows us the ways that armor not only tells us stories of Genesis, stories about patrons and artists and commissions and gifts and debuts on the battlefield or in the tournament lists, but also the ways that these objects persist long past their moments of birth or their initial deployments, and the complex lives that extend beyond the lives of their original wearers. And from the 18th until the early 20th centuries, this armor actually, from the 18th until the early 20th century, new collections of armors were sort of fed by the liquidation of grand familial arsenals. And so this armor was sort of part of that period of liquidation. It was sort of an early victim of it. So from 1579 until probably around 1806, this armor resided in the Royal Arsenal in Munich, first the Ducal Arsenal, then the Royal Arsenal. And around 1800 to 1806, many of the armorers then in Munich were sent to France, actually, under some duress, to signify the Bavarian alliance with Napoleon's consular regime and demonstrate French hegemony. And some of these armors were installed in the Musée Napoléon, which later would become the Musée de l'Artillerie, and then later on, the Musée de l'Armée. So if you've been to the Musée de l'Armée in France, you will have also seen some of these armors. Others were taken as trophies by French generals. And after the Napoleonic Empire fell at Waterloo, many of these objects ended up on the art market. And so the DIA's tilting armor actually bears a shield that alludes to its sort of fate after that Napoleonic period, after it's taken out of the Bavarian Royal Arsenal and ends up on the art market. We see this interesting painted heraldic insignia that I think many viewers, when they first see the armor, think this is the coat of arms of the wearer. But actually it is the shield that recalls one of the most enthusiastic 19th century antiquarians of the British Empire. So this is an armor that was purchased actually from the dealer Samuel Luke Pratt by Sir Archibald Kennedy, who was the Earl of Cassilis and Marquis of Ailsa. And Archibald Kennedy is an interesting figure because he wasn't only a collector of historical arms and armor, he also was a participant in the 1839 Eglinton tournament, which was really a vestige of this medievalism, this revivalist current that animated sort of romantic 19th century British conceptions of what the medieval past was like. And so we know that Kennedy participated in the Eglinton tournament wearing 16th century tilt armors provided by Samuel Luke Pratt to himself and his fellow tournament participants. Luckily, we've been able to ascertain based on primary source research and descriptions of the tournament that the armor that Sir Archibald wore in Eglinton was luckily not our DIA harness, which would be a little bit troubling from a conservation standpoint. But we do have these phenomenal images of him jousting in 1839 as the Knight of the Dolphin. And the Eglinton tournament is an interesting moment because this is a turning point that really inflects the ways that modern people sort of envision the martial past, who think about the age of chivalry through this lens of the 19th century. And truly, this is a tournament that was rained out. The weather was terrible. It was not hugely successful in its performance, but it generated this huge popular culture of representation during the 19th century that evoked, again, this ideal of chivalry that we saw really in its construction phases at the beginning of this talk and thinking about the early days of both armor and heraldry. And the armor that now resides in Detroit lived for quite some time in the 19th and early 20th centuries at Culzean Castle, the castle of Sir Archibald Kennedy, before it too entered the collections of William Randolph Hearst and arrived at the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1948 ahead of the later gift from the Hearst collection. So I think this is such a beautiful way to end the talk and thinking not only about the ways that insignia that emblazon armor, the representations of identity that can exist both in the objects and in the heraldic imagery that they depict and convey, and in the case of the armored horse, process through newly conquered cities, but also the ways that these insignia can tell us about the afterlives of the armor and the way that it continues to have this persistent interests for viewers, for collectors, for later family members, and ultimately for museum audiences today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone just leave their questions in the chat, and then I can read those off. But yes, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat.
And apologies to everyone that I skimmed through a bit of the armored horse content. I'm happy to answer questions about that one. I was a little bit overambitious in my desire to share that lovely armor with everybody. And Sarah, I'm happy to let you choose questions and throw them at me as you're ready.
Well, I guess we're people are still coming up with questions, so might as well go through the part that you had to cut a little bit short.
Yeah, so essentially, one of the other afterlives that I mentioned, I'll skim back through and we can talk about the bit that I cut out, is that this representation in the Tannabum of Maximilian in his 1480 armor that survives, riding the horse in the bard that sadly does not survive, but does in echoes in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, is not, it's not a one-time thing, right? It's not the vestige of a waning culture of remembrance. Instead, it echoes something that is going to be continuing to resonate forward in time. So we get this later book from the 1570s. It's even later than the Tannabum drawings that comes also out of Augsburg. It bears very similar watermarks that represents not only Maximilian on the armored horse, probably a copy after the Tannabum drawing, but all of these great images of Habsburg heralds and princes, a representation of Charles V, probably copied from Titian's painting of the Battle of Mühlberg. So this idea of the sort of steps in transmission that connect the horse armor of 1480 and its earlier representations by Custin to this sort of late 16th century chivalric culture of remembrance are really tangible. And I think they show us how persistently interesting this particular object was. And I want to just show a little interesting evocation here in this image is that we see that the heraldic shield has been highly simplified. It still bears the quartered arms of Habsburg and Burgundy, but it's much more legible than it was in its accurate representation in the Tenabum by Cousteau. We can still see the griffins and fire steels. Those also are depicted in the armored rein of the horse, which we see in the Tenabum image. But in this 1470s image, we get an additional detail, which is the saddle that also is emblazoned with the sparking fire steels of the Order of the Golden Fleece. And this is actually a representation of a saddle that was made in the 1540s for Charles V and used by him around the period of the Battle of Mulberg. So this artist has not only combined the armors for man and horse that are represented by Cousteau separately, sort of put them together in this very sort of compelling image, but also combined 15th century armors with 16th century armors made for Maximilian's successor. So it's this extremely multi-layered way of representing objects, all of which come together to allude to the familial legacy of the House of Habsburg.
So yeah, we have one question from the chat from Megan. Megan asks, Chaz, why would the horse in its splendor enter the city in a page riding it and not the noble rider? Likewise, the helmets being held in hands and not worn.
Yeah, so this is, I think it has to do with the ways that the princes themselves control not only material resources, but human resources, right? So it's this idea that not only do you have all this amazing stuff, but you can deploy other people to present it on your behalf. So it's the idea of the princely retinue. And I think that's one of the ways that the page comes in, right? It's this idea of the refinement and elegance, not only of the self, but of all the sort of folks surrounding you. And we know that that was important, not only in terms of these kinds of entries and tournament entries and triumphal entries, such as the one into Namur, where Albrecht May is riding the armored horse. But we know that that idea of the entourage came up again and again, especially in the Burgundian Low Countries. So Maximilian's predecessor, Philip the Good, when he was Duke of Burgundy, he frequently would rent armors for even lower ranking retainers to make sure all the archers and sort of pages and squires around him were all beautifully armored in complete harnesses, which was extremely expensive. There are instances where we know he pretty much like cleaned out some of the armors in the area in order to make sure that there was the splendid sort of entire retinue that was accompanying him. So I think that that is what we see in the representation of, you know, processing the helms rather than wearing them.
Thank you. Matthew asks, are there examples other than Sir Archibald Kennedy's arms being displayed on art that were part of a later owner's collection?
Absolutely. It happens much more frequently than we would think. And actually, you know, Archibald Kennedy is an interesting example because he's in the 19th century and he does that to several 16th century armors. So the one that I showed in the image of the Eglinton tournament is actually a different armor that I think is now in the Royal Armories in Leeds that he also put his arms on. And that's something also that we see throughout the afterlives of the objects. So in addition to the 19th century application of retrospective arms, we frequently get 17th and 18th century applications of later owners onto 15th century armor. So there is an armet from probably the 1560s or 70s in the Metropolitan Museum that was later adapted as sort of a Jaco del Ponte, a chivalric game helmet for this later iteration of the joust by an Italian family, and they etched their coat of arms all over the side of it. And so when you initially look at it, like, oh, is this who owned this armet in the 15th century? And that's actually it's a 17th century application of the heraldic insignia. And similarly, there is a series of jousting armors that were ordered by the Dukes of Saxony. We have one in Detroit, and there are several all over the world. There were 36 originally. And these armors were not intentionally for a single person, but instead they were rented out to people who they fit well, almost like football pads, and then taken back into the Saxon arsenal. And they were used several times between 1580, 85 and 1719 is the last time they were used. And some of them have layers of paint on the grand guards. So you've actually got, you know, 2 or 3 different names and coats of arms painted on that jousting mantle, of all the different guys who wear them over the course of the 17th and even into the early 18th centuries.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Akash asks, representations of medieval armor still seem to figure heavily in modern heraldry. Do you have a sense of whether this tradition is likely to decline as the original meaning of those items fade from popular memory? Or do you think those objects have become immortalized by heraldry?
Oh, I love that. I love that term. Thank you, Akash. Immortalized by heraldry is a beautiful way to describe what's happening here. And that was happening even in the 17 and 1800s. So I'm going to flip back to the Kolbenhelm, and talk a little bit about this helmet form, because that is exactly what we see in this form, is this idea of, you know, by the 1700s, which is when you get tons and tons of representations of heraldic images with these Kolbenhelms. You even have to be careful because there are sort of funerary helms still being made as part of the heraldic achievement for aristocrats when they pass away in the 17 and 1800s. And sometimes those end up on the market as original objects because people are unable to differentiate them. But in so many instances, you can tell that whoever made that thing was not familiar with this tournament context that Renee of Anjou shows us. And even with this one, I mean, this is a funerary helmet that was made in 1493. This artist knew what a Kolbenhelm was supposed to look like and what it was supposed to do. This does not look like that. Compare this to this helmet in the manuscript leaf, you can see how much different it is. It has a much rounder, smooth surface. It has many more sort of bars coming across the visor to protect you. Because again, if you're wailing on your friends with blunted swords, you really want to make sure everybody's protected. And this one, it just sort of evokes that silhouette. It's an echo. It's a suggestion of the Kolbenhelm, and that's something that you get throughout the intervening centuries. And it's a similar thing that we get with the quote unquote frogmouth helm, the classic jousting helm that we associate with the joust of peace. It's also the insignia of Lawrence Helmschmidt. And so we get these particular kinds of heraldic armors that are used in heraldry because they're associated with this idea of tournament culture. And I think that during the period was really salient because in order to participate in a tournament, you had to prove 3 generations of aristocratic lineage. But then it just got sort of completely ossified within the language of heraldry. And so I doubt that it will prove itself mortal anytime soon.
Makes sense. Donald asks, how long would it take to manufacture a suit of armor?
So that depends on the elaboration of the armor and the number of folks in the workshop. So munitions grade armors could be made quite quickly, within even a matter of days if we're thinking about really low quality work that's left black from the hammer and then painted. But then really beautiful armors like these that we're looking at here could take between 3 and 6 months in some instances. We know that there were instances where armor was ordered for princelings, for young men, and even children who outgrew the armor before it was finished. So there's actually an unfinished armor that survives. It was intended for Charles V. It was ordered for him when he was about 11 or 12. And you know how 11 or 12-year-old boys grow. So it remains rough from the hammer and unfinished because Charles was never able to fit into it.
Oh, rough.
He got a
Ron,
new one.
okay, well, yeah, he's fine, I guess. Ron asks, says it was a very professional and exciting presentation, and says that he's particularly drawn to the toe and heel pikes. Did knights actually go to battle with the foot extensions?
Oh, that is like the favorite question. And I'm gonna see if I can go forward and find the image of, yeah, Friedrich's armor. So these are removable, and they would be used mainly in parade contexts. So you can actually see in this instance there's a little grommet here that helps to connect them, and there's also a little buckle that connects them to the male sabatons underneath. So there's actually soft, almost sock-like sort of male foot defenses underneath these. And then when we think about the armor made by Lawrence Helmschmidt, it's not showing up there. It has gone away. When we think about the armor that would have been worn here, similarly, these toe caps connect with a little spring pin. So there's actually a reasonably long sabaton underneath this that is like foot length. And then there's a spring pin that would allow you to either click the toe cap on or off. And you would probably put those on actually after you're already mounted. So you're not like flopping around in them. You get on the horse and then you put the spring pin toe caps on. And it's totally fashion. They were related to a kind of shoe worn at the Burgundian and French courts called the Pollen, or in German, the Schnabelschuhe, which means beak shoe. And so they're very much fashion in steel, not for battle use.
Ryan asks, aside from the Coleman helms and Tournier helms, I know there are rare depictions of sallets and other helmets on some late 15th century arms. Does this suggest the bearers had more of a martial background?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that really invites additional research. I think that there are sallets that show up. I think they're quite a bit less common, and they tend to be for folks who are I don't want to say more of a middling level, but who are of more of a martial background. So we frequently see Kolben helms and Steckhelms in arms associated with quite elevated bearers. And the times that I have seen a sallet or a renhut, we could associate it with the rennen, which is the joust of war, and you're wearing the streamlined, actually not unlike the hat that Maximilian is wearing here, which is probably a woven hat or a fabric covered sallet. But you can also think about the ways that that evokes sort of more of a martial identity. And one of the most vivid deployments of a sallet that I can think of in heraldry is Lawrence Helmschmidt's own arms, which, as I mentioned, are a rooster holding a mace in one of its little chicken claws and wearing a sallet helmet. And standing next to the Scheckhelm that is Lawrence's device. So it's like he himself, if sort of personified by this cock, is wearing the sallet. So we can think about the ways that that may evoke a different sort of identity for the bearer. But again, I think that would be an interesting channel of additional research.
Definitely. Mark asks if there's possibly a list of like a bibliography of the different manuscripts where the images from the presentation came from, that you could potentially share.
I would be happy to share that. And the best place to find sort of most of these manuscripts is my recent book, because that's where I collect all this stuff. It was an opportunity to bring together a lot of comparanda. But I'd be happy to share a list of primary sources. And one of the things that is so beautiful about the moment that we live in today is that many of the primary sources, not the Chernobyl, sadly, because it lives in Prague in a collection that has not yet digitized it. But many of the sources I shared are available for free online in high-res iterations through places like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek and the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek. So we live in a moment where you can actually go and hunt through these things and sort of flip through the pages.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's been transformative, certainly. Does anyone else have any questions? I guess I can ask one question. So I noticed in a lot of the museum displays of armor, typically the cod piece is missing. Do you know what has happened to the cod piece? Do we still have them, or is it simply a curatorial choice to
So
not?
there weren't always cod pieces. So the cod piece is an interesting question, and I will say, at secretly at the Met there is a drawer of them that have been disembodied from their armors, but they weren't always part of the armor itself. So this is a great image to have up on the screen when we have this conversation. So what you can see protecting Maximilian's groin here as he rides his horse is a male brayette, which we have a gorgeous example of here in Detroit, but it's a pair of male trunks. So it's little shorts made of mail. And that would have been sufficient for most late Gothic armor, particularly armor that would have been intended to be worn mounted. And one reason for that is that you've got this armored saddle that has a steel cantle, so it itself is really protecting that region. And also you can imagine that if you had a steel cod piece, it would be like very much in the way. So in this case, it would not have, had that element associated with it. And we can see how, the armor itself as represented is, essentially just the arming points. All of this purple leather is new, but based on primary sources of what the armor would have looked like in its youth. But then when you think about the armors that I showed from my collection, and I'm gonna apologies for speeding through the slides. We get to things like this, and so this is late 16th century. So this is a little bit after the golden age of the codpiece and male costume. But this is an armor that would have also been worn mounted, and so again, you've got that steel cantle plate, and it's very, very light. So again, all the other there are a lot of what we would consider sort of openings in this armor, but again, you're sacrificing nimbleness, or you're sacrificing protection for nimbleness. And finally, in the case of the beautiful Bavarian armor that I finished up with, again, this is mainly for tournament use. So in a tournament, you shouldn't have to worry about your friends hitting below the belt, as it were, and they'll get disqualified if they do. In Rene of Anjou's tournament book from about 120 years earlier, he talks about knights who don't comport themselves in a chivalric way getting put on their saddles on the sides of the list, and that's like it's like the penalty box in hockey. So there is this sort of assumption here that everybody's going to behave in the way that they should. The place that you do find really good cod pieces is in costume armor. So if you think about like the Landsknecht armor of Wilhelm von Rogendorf, which is in Vienna and has these big puffed and slashed sleeves, it's intended to be essentially the steel iteration of the kinds of costumes you see on people like Henry VIII. That's one that really evokes that sort of bombastic aspect of male costume. That was a long answer about cod
No,
pieces.
no. Fascinating. Akash asks, are there examples of images of armor being used to construct public images for prominent women other than reigning monarchs? And if so, what do they reveal about the differences in how male and female power were represented in the public sphere?
So there are very few iterations of images of women or even accounts of women wearing armor. I will, as sort of another personal plug, say that I wrote an essay for a catalog called Iron Men, Fashion and Steel that came out from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna last year that talks about images and texts related to women wearers of armor, which are very rare. And the reason for that is that the book of Leviticus specifically prohibits women from wearing armor in its prohibition against cross-dressing. So there's that biblical passage that says a woman shall not take up the garments of a man, or shall a man wear the garments of a woman. And within the sort of extremely Judeo-Christian culture of the medieval past, people took that very, very seriously. And that was actually sort of instrumental in the condemnation of Joan of Arc in 1431. So she was actually not condemned for her, by the Burgundians and the English for her role against them, or her role as a military leader, or for sort of her function within the 100 Years' War, but she was condemned for wearing armor. And for sort of deigning to adopt that most masculine of garments. And so for that reason, it was quite treacherous, I think, for women to present themselves publicly in that way. We know that Caterina Sforza, who was the Countess of Forlì in the late 15th century in Italy, based on primary sources, we think that she wore secret armor underneath her clothes. So she would wear something like a brigandine with steel plates sewn into the bodice of her gowns, which we don't know how frequently that happened. It may have happened more than we know. But there are very, very few instances where we see women depicted specifically in armor during the period.
I had no idea that was the origins of that. That's interesting. Ryan asks, he says, thank you. I visited the DIA last year and there weren't that many armors on display. Are there plans to show more of the collection anytime soon?
Yes, that's a great question. So we are in the process, even now, of ordering new cases. So the armors that inhabit the DIA, we have a collection of martial objects that includes about 250 objects, actually, and that's not only complete armors, but also elements, so things like helmets and gauntlets and swords and firearms and all kinds of things. The armors in particular experienced a case failure in 2016, which is something that can happen to museums as casework ages. And so several of our cases actually shattered. And so one of my sort of big missions, really, as the first advocate, as an expert for these collections, is to get new casework. And so we are actually right now ordering the first round of new cases. So you will see more armors in the galleries in the next year. And then in 2027, we have a major exhibition on the books called Steel Towns, Armor, Artistry, and Innovation in Renaissance Cities, which will be one of the first exhibition projects to really focus not necessarily on the wearers, who have gotten lots of exhibitions, so people like Maximilian I and Henry VIII, but on the makers themselves. So we're going to shift from talking about Maximilian to talking about Lawrence Helmschmidt and his sort of compatriots within centers of the armor industry. So that exhibition will feature not only 25 of our DIA objects, but also an additional roughly 75 to 80 loans from across the US and Europe. So be sure to come to Detroit in 2027.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much. I think we're kind of at time. But yes, thank you. We will also hopefully have this recording up soon on our YouTube channel for anyone to reference and enjoy. And yes, thank you all for being here. Have a good night.